Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here as part of the 50th anniversary celebrations. And thank you, Heather, for that lovely introduction. I'm going to start with a story. A couple of years ago, I was asked to appear on a BBC show called The Hub, hosted by Nick Going. The theme was Asian megacities, with a city that has been the site of quite a bit of my research, Kolkata, as the poster child for the crisis of the megacity. Going's argument, delivered in his usual belligerent style, was that there's been a complete failure of urban planning in India, and that the most obvious manifestation of this is the inadequacy of urban infrastructure. His evidence was that ubiquitous icon of the crisis-ridden megacity, the slum. In tongue-in-cheek fashion, I show you images of this performance taken by my mother as she watched the show live in Kolkata. The show does not air in California. I'm interested in the Orientalist montage that takes up the screen. Images of slums in Mumbai, the conversation was about Kolkata, the news ticker that says that 30 million people live in slums in Bangladesh. But I'm also interested in how our scholarship enters into circuits of global common sense about urban problems. Suffice it to say, and you can tell from the look on my face, that in my few minutes on the show, I found myself unable to shout down Nick Going with any complex argument about megacities and slums or critical urban studies. Strangely, he did not even seem to want a solution, something that most television shows usually want from urban planners. He wanted me to simply agree with him that urban planning in India was a failure. After all, he noted that I had authored a piece titled "Why India Cannot Plan Its Cities," which I had. I have to admit that in the closing seconds of my shouting match with Going, I was tempted to blame it all, slums, megacities, failed urban planning, on British colonialism. But this encounter, while trivial and predictable, broaches the question of the slum, and specifically the question of how, in an age of global urbanism, the slum becomes the site of reform, intervention, and even aspiration. Today, in my talk, I want to outline what I see to be a new moment in governing the slum, and I want to analyze what this might tell us about planning and development at the present historical conjuncture. In doing so, I'm going to deliberately use the term slum, knowing full well that it is a poor shorthand for the complexity and heterogeneity of urban habitation and tenure arrangements, for dense and variegated economies of work and livelihood. I'm going to talk about the slum as an object of administration and as a horizon of collective action. So with this in mind, I want to locate the question of the slum at the interface of what in my new work I'm calling bureaucracies of poverty and poor people's movements. I argue that governing the slum presents some interesting dilemmas which cannot be interpreted solely through the dominant conceptual frameworks of neoliberalization or the right to the city. A different agenda of scholarship and a different politics of spatial justice might very well be at stake. So let me return to the scene of Going's rage, the Indian megacity. As Going was railing about the incapacity of the Indian state, so in fact, one of the most ambitious national urban planning endeavors was underway in India. And its key target was precisely the object of his anxiety, the slum. Launched in 2005, the National Urban Renewal Mission is evocative of Nehruvian modernization. Except that this time, the building of infrastructure is not about the building of the nation, it is about reforming the city. We're all familiar with that language of reform, about the conditionalities of reform that accompany development projects and infrastructure projects financed by multilateral and regional development banks. In this case, these are reforms imposed by the central government of India on state governments and urban governments and includes everything from the levying of water taxes to the liberalization of land and housing markets to the creation of municipal bond markets. One of the boldest parts of the National Urban Renewal Mission, which I've been studying this past year during my sabbatical, is the Rajiv Awas Yojana, RAY, or Slum-Free Cities, as the program has come to be called. Its mandate is the following: to build a slum-free India with inclusive and equitable cities in which every citizen has access to basic civic infrastructure and social amenities and decent shelter. In rhetoric, if not in practice, slum-free cities is an important departure from the slum evictions and demolitions that have dominated the scene in India. Forced evictions in the name of urban development. And quite a bit of my academic work has been focused on those evictions and displacements. So just to give you a glimpse of that previous era, or what I would argue is an era that still continues alongside this new impulse, in Indian cities for many decades now, we have witnessed the literal erasure of the urban poor from lived space. Here is one example drawn from the work of Gautam Bhan. So these are before and after images of Pushta, a settlement on the banks of the river Yamuna in Delhi. 30 years, 150,000 residents, cleared in the blink of an eye on the occasion of the Commonwealth Games hosted a few years ago in Delhi. A great deal of my research has been concerned with how urban planning in India, along with judicial interventions, has criminalized the informal housing of the poor while regularizing and even enabling the informal urbanization of the wealthy and the powerful. I'll give you one example from that previous research. So this is in Kolkata. While unemployed factory workers were evicted from these residential quarters, and you see the last of them here, quarter number 411, to make way for a grand global urbanism project titled South City, the usual upscale retail and residential development built in so many cities around the world, these factory workers who had lived here for several decades were defined as illegal encroachers and evicted violently almost overnight without notice or compensation. But in fact, what happened as these towers were completed is a recognition through the activism of those factory workers, including one who refused to move, that these towers themselves were illegal, that they had been built in violation of environmental laws and through the enclosure of the city's largest and last water body. But with slum-free cities, one can argue that this era is over. Not really, but I am suggesting that these practices are now being accommodated and justified within a new paradigm, which in India and elsewhere in the global south is being called inclusive growth. Now, some can argue that inclusive growth is nothing more than an oxymoron, market-oriented social inclusion. But I'm interested in the ways in which inclusive growth in slum-free cities, as an example of inclusive growth, combines somewhat uncomfortably multiple arguments about an object of administration, in this case, the slum. So in the case of slum-free cities, first, and most interestingly perhaps, slum-free cities expresses an impulse for social protection, even social democracy. Its main author titled the think piece leading up to the policy as a New Deal for India's urban poor. The policy confers political recognition on slum dwellers as urban citizens and pieces together elements of an urban welfare state in the making. It has thus been a policy produced by and hailed by activists in India who see this as the first attempt by the central government to express commitment to housing the urban poor and expressing a right to shelter. A right to shelter that has been long coming in India because other rights, such as the rights to information, education, and health, were won, at least in rhetoric, a while ago. But Alongside a new deal for India's urban poor, slum-free cities is also about slum redevelopment. Explicit in the framework is a push to transform slum lands into urban assets. In the slum-free plans of action that each state in India is required to draw up, public-private partnerships for slum redevelopment are mandatory. Third, and perhaps less tangibly, but perhaps equally importantly, slum-free cities expresses great optimism about the inherent entrepreneurialism of slums, slum dwellers, and the urban informal economy. No longer seen as places of abject poverty and despair, slums are now examples of what a recent architectural exhibition called Jugaad urbanism. Jugaad is a Hindi word that is similar to bricolage, to improvising, to making do with very little and yet being creative. This is therefore an epistemology of poverty that sees the slum as a system of self-organization. The slum is an example of inspired, duct-taped ingenuity. Now, it's obvious to you that there's significant contradictions across these three elements that inclusive growth or slum-free cities tries to assemble. What holds them together in the case of slum-free cities is one thing or one person, I kid you not, Hernando de Soto. De Soto looms large as consultant and inspiration for the policy. His idea that the urban poor are heroic entrepreneurs whose debt capital of slum lands can be converted into liquid capital lies at the heart of slum-free cities and, more ambitiously, inclusive growth. In fact, in announcing the policy, India's then Minister of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, in a talk titled Inclusive Paradigms for Inclusive Growth, there's a lot of tautology that goes on in these policy frameworks, she posed a question inspired directly by De Soto. How do we create a process by which the poor can convert capital from the extra-legal to the legal sphere, and in so doing, contribute to GDP at the bottom of the pyramid? The minister concluded thus: Mr. De Soto's work suggests that the poor do have the tools to bring themselves out of poverty. They simply lack the capability which can be given to them by according them property rights. Security of tenure, check. Slum redevelopment, check. Entrepreneurialism, check. If only we could live life according to Hernando de Soto. I'm going to return to these questions of property and personhood that slum-free cities raises. The minister's argument that what is needed is to simply grant the poor property rights, and that will create a magical capability to find their way out of poverty. But first, I want to situate this program and inclusive growth in a broader global context, which I think is very important for us as urban planners to keep in mind. In the 21st century, geographies of development are being rapidly rearranged. From economic ascendance in India and China to new transactions of aid and development across the global south, to the rise of the BRICS as a hegemonic formation, to a reshuffling of the Bretton Woods order, a new global architecture is being formed. Such processes remind us that if we are to talk about the global south, we must do so not as a geographical location, but instead as a project of governing, a project of rule, a project with distinctive aspirations about economic growth and development. This project has a long history. One of my favorite books that narrates that history is Vijay Prasad's The Poorer Nations. In particular, Prasad draws our attention to the South Commission of the late 1980s, which he sees at once as a rejoinder to North Atlantic structural adjustment, as well as what he calls neoliberalism with Southern characteristics. In that book, Prasad draws our attention to one interesting moment when Manmohan Singh, who was later to become Prime Minister of India, was Secretary General of the South Commission. And in a landmark speech to the World Bank, he argued that new locomotive forces have to be found within the South itself. I'm arguing that in the 21st century, such locomotive forces have indeed been found. They are indeed in the global South. They're clearly not in the North Atlantic. But it is also in the large middle-income countries of the global South that poverty is now concentrated. What Andy Sumner and Ravi Kanbur have called a new geography of global poverty. So think India, not Haiti. And so it is in the BRICS that the task of alleviating poverty has to be reconciled with economic growth. And this is the mandate of inclusive growth. Now, I also want to point out that there are many instantiations of inclusive growth. In previous work on microfinance, I have analyzed such enactments of inclusion as instances of poverty capitalism, where the world's bottom billion, the billion or so people living under conditions of extreme poverty, are integrated into financial systems, but also become the new frontiers of debt and subprime profit. My current research is concerned with a different type of inclusion. The proliferation of ambitious social protection and human development programs in many parts of the world, particularly in the global South. What Richard Ballard has called the reinvention of development for the poor. From conditional cash transfers to guaranteed minimum income proposals to food, housing, and education schemes, these are not programs that can be easily interpreted in the register of neoliberalization. Are there elements of a neoliberal ethos in many of these programs? Absolutely. Take, for example, the case of co-responsibility, which is central to the conditional cash transfers of Latin America, putting, as Maxine Molyneux has so elegantly argued, female altruism at the service of the state. But is the critique of neoliberalism sufficient for an understanding of these programs? I don't think so. The new poverty agenda, as Molyneux calls it, is part of a dramatic expansion of the role of the democratic and developmental state in Latin America. In the case of South Africa, Sue Parnell and Jenny Robinson have made a similar argument about the developmental agenda of local government, which they note has included not only basic needs programs, but also a formal commitment to participation. Thus, at a workshop I recently convened to launch a new research, policy, and pedagogic collaboration that will connect the context of Brazil, India, and South Africa, we focused on neoliberalism not as a primary reference, but instead on what James Ferguson has recently pinpointed as the revalorization of distribution, notably distributive state policy. This is the proposition of inclusive growth. It is even the proposition of the welfare state in the making in the global South. Put another way, instead of trying to figure out whether this is neoliberalism in some guise or the other, I'm interested in a related and yet different question, which is how does liberal government practice social assistance and social protection? This is an old question. And in urban planning, it poses the question of how public obligation is exercised towards poor others. The question I'm noting takes on a new form in the global South, where bold experiments with welfare and development depart from the North Atlantic welfare state and the notions of personhood on which its entitlements rest. For example, in these contexts in the global South, the question of welfare is not necessarily yoked to the figure of the industrial worker. Instead of the gendered social contract of industrial capitalism, which pivots on what feminist theorists Nancy Fraser and Linda Gordon describe as the worker and his negatives, scholars of development are pointing to non-laborist models of welfare that are being forged in a world where, to quote Jim Ferguson, both labor and forms of social membership based upon it are of diminishing value. This is, of course, Guy Standing's argument about a global precariat and his call for a new politics of social policy, for him, basic minimum income, to deal with such precarity. There are important discussions and debates to be had in planning about the implications of such social personhood. But there's also something else at stake in these experiments with inclusive growth that takes us back to slum-free cities, and in particular to that question of property rights. I'm borrowing a phrase from one of my former doctoral students and now professor at Rutgers, Asher Gertner, propriety of property. I'm very interested in how in slum-free cities in particular, what is at stake is the propriety of property. Both security of tenure and slum redevelopment, in the case of this policy, hinge on the conferral of legal title to slum dwellers in quite progressive fashion. It's a moment that those of us working in the Indian context as scholars and activists have been waiting for many decades. And it was a conferral defined as either on the woman or jointly on the main male householder. These titles the policy requires must be mortgageable and heritable so as to enable access to formal credit mechanisms. But I'm also interested in the ways in which the propriety of property has some quite stark limits. For example, it is not so easy to convert the dizzying complexity of property and tenure arrangements that go by the shorthand slum into neat little parcels of cadastral property, and even bolder, to turn this cadastral property into globally legible real estate markets. We know that most of the residents of slums in Indian cities are actually tenants. We know from the research of Jeffrey Payne that in many parts of the world, titling does not guarantee security of tenure and often displaces the poorest. We know from the research of Alan Gilbert that property titles do not necessarily expand the access of the urban poor to formal mortgage credit. We know that in contexts where there's been the vigorous use of eminent domain to procure land for public purpose projects, property titles, even formal and legal, cannot protect against forced evictions. But there's something more then at stake in creating property regimes. Here it is instructive to return to the argument of Hernando de Soto, not because he's correct, but because he's so darn influential while being so wrong. For De Soto, titling matters because it is a process of representation. The phrase he used in India around slum-free cities was this would allow the poor man to have his value represented on paper. This idea is in turn embedded in a broader paradigm evident in his book, The Mystery of Capital, in which he writes that capital is a representational process. So not a process of production, but a representational process. For him, the poor are not workers, but rather informal entrepreneurs who own assets, albeit those rendered useless by faulty representation. De Soto writes, Marx would probably be shocked to find how in developing countries, much of the teeming mass does not consist of oppressed legal proletarians, but of oppressed extra-legal small entrepreneurs with a sizable amount of assets. Marx would indeed be shocked. This is the epistemology of poverty in our brave new world. And this is what we must confront, critique, and transform as urban planners. Not surprisingly then, central to inclusive growth and slum-free cities in India is this project of representation. And one example of this, and the two go hand in hand, inclusive growth and this project, is a very ambitious national project called Aadhaar, which is the Indian government's project of unique identification, of creating biometric identification for every citizen of India, spearheaded by Nanda Nilekani, a mogul of India's software industry. Nilekani, in talking about Aadhaar, says inclusive growth is about giving identity, about giving every Indian an acknowledged existence, and then letting them participate in the fruits of development. Note how he frames this. He says, 30 years ago, we talked about roti, kapra, or makan, food, clothing, and shelter. In the last 10 years, we talked about Bijli Sadak Pani, infrastructure, electricity, roads, water. In the next 10 years, it's going to be about bank accounts, mobile cell phones, and Aadhaar. He calls this the power of identity, deliberately and explicitly redeploying Manuel Castells' phrase of the power of identity. And you can tell that this idea of representing, of acknowledging existence, and thereby setting into motion a magical process of development is almost identical to De Soto. So I'm interested in this set of calculative practices meant to make poverty visible, meant to establish the foundations not only of social inclusion, but also of a bottom billion capitalism eager to capitalize the shadow economies of the poor. Put another way, I'm interested in how accumulation, even dispossession, proceed not only through evictions and displacements, but also through inclusive paradigms of development, by making sure that the poor man has his value represented on paper. For me, a key piece of this is the question of property. And in this last year on sabbatical, my research has been a quite sprawling project interested in what I'm calling the urban land question. And in particular, I find myself returning over and over again to the question of property. In the Indian case, I'm increasingly connecting slum-free cities and its imaginations of the propriety of property to land settlement policies initiated by the British, including by the East India Trading Company in 1793. That's what sabbaticals are for. But in thinking about property, my detour, and it's become much more than a detour, it's become a real passion, has been to think about property in the context of other sites of struggle and debate. And I'm going to give you a glimpse of one side to give you also then a sense of what I mean by the propriety of property and how it might also have stark limits. The subject of my current research, in fact, is not in India. It's in Chicago. And it's on the south side of Chicago. I was drawn in 2013 to an article that graced the cover of the New York Times Magazine called The Death and Life of Chicago, which delineated a divided city. On the one hand, a global city, a tourist destination, a city of finance, a city characterized by the downtown Renaissance, and on the other hand, what the article described as a city of derelict communities of resources, neighborhoods with abandoned homes and schools facing closure. One of the urban planners interviewed for that article described Chicago thus: as resembling London or Jakarta with a hyper-dense core, a zone of affluence, and something else beyond. I was interested in the something else beyond, because that something else beyond were the edges of Chicago, places like the South Side, that were badly hit by foreclosures, and that the essay described as a geography of the peripheries. In fact, the word used by the author of the New York Times essay was banlieue, that a largely ethnic poor and working class had been relegated to the banlieues of Chicago. In a just-released book titled Territories of Poverty, co-edited with Emma Shaw Crane, I write about these American foreclosed peripheries. And I argue that these are not just evacuated spaces, but rather they're territories. They are places where racialized and financialized impoverishment are being enacted. But I also, following that New York Times essay, note that there's much more to these peripheries of Chicago than simply financialized impoverishment. The purpose of the New York Times essay was to draw attention to how the epidemic of empty foreclosed homes had ignited a new form of guerrilla activism, notably something called the Chicago Anti-Eviction campaign, a radical urban homesteader movement with an elegant motto: homeless people in peopleless homes. Homeless people in peopleless homes. This movement, which I have been trying to understand now for almost a year, is keenly attuned to the predations of finance capital, and it is also an example of how urban social movements are organized around global, multi-scalar imaginations of crisis and dispossession. What is particularly interesting for me is that the movement in Chicago is directly modeled after, in fact, it was set up by the Western Cape Anti-Eviction campaign in Cape Town, South Africa. That movement no longer exists, but it was an extremely important and powerful movement in Cape Town when it did. And in fact, its legacies in Chicago are quite apparent. I can say a lot about these globally interconnected poor people's movements and the ways in which they are not necessarily movements in the familiar register of the right to the city, that they in fact use other idioms of protest and collective action, and I hope we can have that conversation. But what I want to focus on for the purposes of this talk is an argument about home and property. So what is important about the Chicago Anti-Eviction campaign, and the reason why it has been such a productive site for me to think about property parallel to the India case, is that the claims to property, the claims to homesteading, in the case of this particular movement, pivot on particular statutes in the municipal code of the city of Chicago that make it possible for occupiers of vacant buildings, if they can demonstrate that they have improved and beautified the property, to stay in those buildings for short periods of time. There is no formal or legal pathway to the formalization of those claims, but those vacant buildings ordinances, hinging on questions of the beautification and improvement of property, therefore make possible temporary claims. And in fact, the movement has conducted a variety of home occupations or home liberations, as the movement puts it, under the banner of these vacant buildings ordinances. This is quite similar to what in previous work in studying Homes Not Jails, a San Francisco-based squatter group, I argued were examples of homesteading that at once disrupted and consolidated notions of property. In my earlier work, I argued that these movements had to be understood as challenges to American paradigms of propertied citizenship, and yet to practices of homesteading at the frontiers of cities through these motifs and through the invocation of the beautification and improvement of property. They also often consolidated paradigms of propertied citizenship. This is precisely what Libby Potter in new work has noted as possessory politics. She writes that struggles against dispossession too easily become struggles for possession, often through the assertion of rights. Put another way, in holding India's slum-free cities and the Chicago anti-eviction campaign in simultaneous view, the question I'm interested in is this: is a politics of land and housing that defies liberalism's compass of property and personhood possible? It is perhaps at these limits of politics that we can ask a more profound question. How do democracies, liberal democracies, reproduce inequality, spatialized inequality? And this, in many ways, is the question that animates the new institute that I've been charged with establishing at UCLA, the Institute on Inequality and Democracy. But it is also at these limits that I take seriously the slum as an object of administration, and that I take seriously possessory politics as a claim to rights and possibly even to citizenship. So for this, let us return one last time to slum-free cities. I want to share with you some glimpses of ethnographic fieldwork that I was conducting earlier this year in India. When I arrived in India for this fieldwork, I found out that under the new regime, RAE would no longer be implemented. It's interesting to arrive to do an ethnography of something that is being shut down. But pilot projects were in place and were well underway. And it was clear that Ray was going to morph into something that the new regime was going to then take credit for, but that the aspirations set up by Ray were there to stay. And something more profound had happened with Ray, with Slum-Free cities. It had activated, for the first time in modern India, the municipality as a scale of administration and the urban as a site of government, all organized around the governing of the slum. So I want to demonstrate that to you by sharing with you some ethnographic fieldwork. So earlier this year, when I decided to spend a few months tracing the life of slum-free cities, this program that seemed to be about to disappear, but whose pilot programs were alive and well, I made my way from the ministries of Delhi, imposing in their rituals of centralization and standardization, to municipalities that ring the Kolkata metropolitan region, beyond the zone of familiarity, beyond the city, beyond what I had once written about as the rural-urban interface. I was searching for urban India. I was searching for the ways in which, by launching these national programs, the central government of India was bringing into being the urban as a scale of administration, putting into motion an urban welfare state, but more importantly, a standardized urban administration that the country had not seen, not even in British times. So along one-lane roads that claimed to be highways, trucks precariously piled with onions and potatoes, barreling alongside ubiquitous and snail-speed bicycles, I went on my search for the urban. Tractors lumbered to paddy fields, while incessantly honking cars tried to claim a right-of-way, as if the tolls they had paid to enter these highways were an entitlement of sorts. These highways, if we are to call them that, did not lead to municipalities. To get to them, one had to turn onto even narrower roads, pitch dark at night, roads that snaked through ponds lush with greenery, bustling markets spilling out onto that sliver of asphalt, a montage of village huts and pucca houses, tiny stores offering services, from hairdressing to Xeroxing. Often the road would pass a railway station, and then one would know that one had arrived at the urban, at the municipality, at the administrative unit designated in 1992 by India's 74th constitutional amendment as an urban local body. It is thus that I arrived one morning at Dankuni, a new municipality that had been constituted a few years ago out of 3.5 panchayats. The panchayat is an administrative unit for villages in India. A newly painted green building that houses the offices of the Dankuni municipality, depicted here with my interlocutors, the urban planner, the engineer, and the assistant engineer. This particular building has been repurposed for the urban functions of government. The Dankuni municipality, like other urban local bodies in India, has been empowered, or should I say required, by the 74th Amendment to undertake various functions, ranging from town planning to the provision of water and sanitation infrastructure, to urban forestry, to slum improvement, to the keeping of vital statistics, including registration of births and deaths. The bustle of vital statistics, long lines of men and women waiting to register a birth or death or to get a trade license, I realized was the primary work of these municipalities. That was the work of urban planning conducted by municipal level urban planning planners and engineers. But slum-free cities had done something else. It had turned the slum into a visible and governable object for these municipalities, and it had made the governing of the slum a crucial conduit, relinking central government and municipality. But more importantly, creating a new relationship between the urban planner, engineer, assistant engineer, and the people. So it is from this location that I launched my research tours of the slums of Dankuni. a familiar tangle of improvised shelter and upgraded homes, rendered unfamiliar outside the grid of urban agglomeration and human density. Here, fields stretched to the horizon, houses could conceivably stretch their elbows, infrastructure could be laid through empty swaths of land. I couldn't tell at first that these were slums, but they had been designated as such. So was the slum the sign that the urban had arrived in these zones beyond the familiar city? Was the slum the sign of the newness of urban administration? Now, I should note that in many cases, these were not new slums. In another municipality north of Dankuni, Bhatpara, I pored over the plans, maps, and documents of the municipality. In doing so, I confronted an extraordinary piece of historical geography. Much of the land use of the municipality, everything you see here marked in blue, was a slum. So, in fact, what we have here is a case of trying to figure out what in Bhatpara is not a slum. But this is, of course, not a manifestation of the apocalyptic story of a planet of slums as told by Mike Davis. There is no hand of global neoliberalism invisible behind this map. Not at all. These are very old slums, necessary companions to the coolie lines of the jute and paper mills once built by the British in this valuable agro-industrial hinterland of the empire. I grew up, I'm told, in one such paper mill where my father served as director of a British managing agency house. Needless to say, I do not remember the slums. So it is in municipalities like Dankuni and Bhatpara that slum-free cities is being implemented not just as a pilot project, but in this grand enterprise of governing the slum and therefore creating urban government itself. And I'm arguing that this program has signaled a dramatic shift in the relationship between government and slum, a relationship that until now in India had been designated as that between sovereign and encroacher. And the relationship is now being recast as state and beneficiary. So my first point was that around the propriety of property. Property is a dilemma, as an aspiration, as a limit. This is my second point and closing point about this program, but more generally about inclusive growth. The relationship between state and beneficiary, and most importantly, between state and self-styled beneficiary. So inscribed on the walls of slum houses in Dankuni are the signs of different iterations of programs of government, each preceded by a comprehensive survey that numbers and marks homes of the beneficiaries. Survey, but the program that went before it, BSUP, also coming out of the National Urban Renewal Mission, each accompanied by a comprehensive survey. In the offices of Bhatpara municipality are the DPRs, the detailed project reports that must be sanctioned by the Delhi bureaucracy. And in going through the folder handed to me by the chief engineer, I was astounded by these lists. I wanted to spend all day with them. These photographs of beneficiaries, thumbprints and photographs of slum dwellers cast as beneficiaries. And walking the slums with local politicians and municipal officials, I was repeatedly asked by them to photograph potential beneficiaries of slum-free cities and their slum houses that were going to be upgraded and formalized by that program. My photographs could not do justice to such anticipation and aspiration. All I could do was take notice. And sometimes, without prodding from a local councillor or municipal engineer, a beneficiary would emerge from an upgraded house to complain about the shoddy work, to curse the government contractors. Photograph this, she would insist. Photograph the water leaks. Photograph the cracks in the wall. Photograph the tilt in the foundations. And sometimes, without warning, our car would be gherawed, surrounded by young men in the slum, rolling up their shirt sleeves and hitching up their lungis, upset that the promise of cleaning up the promise of cleaning up the village pond, which was now municipal pond, had not been met. "We will beat you up," they would shout. "We will not release a car until you pay up." Not directly at anyone, but into thin air, as if in engagement with imaginary adversaries. "Didn't you say that the pond would become a swimming pool?" a young man shouted at the municipal engineer and urban planner, who were pretending not to hear. My ethnographic notes could not do justice to this demand for improvement, urban government as a demand for improvement. All I could do was take notice. These photographs and notes of state-designated and self-styled beneficiaries force us to consider the political potentialities of inclusive growth, to understand this formation as something more than the inexorable spread of global neoliberalization. And to understand such formations, we need not only the photo gallery of beneficiaries, but also the traces of many generations of programs of government, some ghostly, some belonging to an urgently anticipated present. So here, for example, is the fossil of an old DFID-funded program called KUSP, Kolkata Urban Services Project, along with the recent stamp of the ruling political party in West Bengal, the Trinamool Congress, as it prepared for upcoming municipal elections. So this is a glimpse of the iterative processes of government through which the slum is made governable, through which the state itself comes into being, but through which, most importantly, governable subjects are produced. It is a governing, though, that is always subject to disruption. What I'm calling for then is attention to the slum, indeed to the urban, as a governmental category or as governmental categories. Whether or not the slum is a faithful depiction of actually existing socio-spatial processes is one set of analytical considerations. But an equally important task is to understand why these categories matter and how they're deployed in the repeated work of government. So another way of framing this is to ask if there is a distinctive politics of the governed, Partha Chatterjee's felicitous phrase, that is at stake in the urban. And indeed, recent debates in urban studies suggest that this is the case, be it in assertions of the right to the city or insurgent citizenship by city dwellers. But in municipalities like Dankuli and Bhatpara, beyond the familiar zones of street politics and rights-based movements, I found myself returning inevitably to the category of beneficiary, self-styled beneficiary. It is through the collection of beneficiaries, the recipient of those functions designated to urban local bodies by the 74th Constitutional Amendment of India, that the urban comes to have meaning as a governmental category. It is tempting to read such a governmental category as indicating a certain politics. What would we want to think of as urban politics if it is nothing more than a collection of beneficiaries? So let me conclude by exploring that question. The urban. The urban is a project of critical theory. The urban is a project of political imagination. The urban is a project always concerned with historical alternatives. In a scarcely known working paper buried in the library at UC Berkeley, Manuel Castells reflects on the shift in his work from the seminal The Urban Question, that took me to Berkeley actually to work with Manuel, to the magisterial The City and the Grassroots. Castells notes that in the latter, there is a theory of urban social change as part of a theory of the city. Castells does not embark on a search for a singular revolutionary subject of this urban social change. Instead, he argues that while this is purposive collective action, it comes from a plurality of sources, not just one. Indeed, such action is not solely concerned with collective consumption, the emphasis of Castells' early work. Castells asserts that the city and the grassroots widens the discussion to consider urban social movements that connect three dimensions: collective consumption, political self-management, and cultural identity. In doing so, though, what Castells gives us is what Andy Merrifield has recently called a new political subject: the urban social movements, urban mobilization. Castells argues that these urban social movements have consciousness as citizen movements and not just as a derivation from class or other types of movements. In putting forward such a formulation, Castells valiantly reflects on theoretical legacies, arguing that for him Marx's theory is only one source of work among many others, and that it is often blind to major issues, for instance, feminism, and that it has an inability to understand some key elements like culture. But in rendering class, or at least a Marxian understanding of class, contingent, Castells renders the urban as a necessary, even foundational element of a theory of social change, arguing that the urban is revolutionary. The urban is political. In fact, urban studies and planning today is overflowing with arguments about urban citizens, residents, occupants, movements, experiences as the new political subject, as the subject of history. I'm not going to stage an overview of this literature because it's both substantial and well known. Perhaps most boldly in Warren Magnuson, the urban becomes a political ontology. In his words, a particular way of being political. But in Dankuni and Patpara, in the ethnographic glimpses I shared with you, I could not gather together the claims pressed by newly urban beneficiaries as a struggle for generalized democracy. There in the old slums adjoining the coolie lines of jute mills and paper mills, on land settled by the East India Trading Company, I could not find what Saskia Sassen calls the logic of expulsions, an argument I think directly borrowed from David Harvey with very little acknowledgement of Harvey's work. Nor could I find an urban political movement to resist such predations. Instead, I want to foreground the deep ambiguities and ambivalences that attend the urban, always accompanied in much of the world by the not urban, the rural, the agrarian, the agro-industrial. And that mix of constitutionally empowered urban local bodies geared up for cycles of municipal elections and project sanctions with intimate transactions of rural patronage and all equally intimate governance also requires our attention, not as politics, but as political. But this very may well be the grassroots of an urban world. And if this is the case, I must strongly disagree with Magnuson when he notes that the fundamental question is of the city, not the state. The fundamental question is of the city, not the state. The urban, I'm arguing, is definitely a particular way of being governmental. My rephrasing of Magnuson's line. So my call to those of us in urban studies and planning is that we take up the question of whether the urban is a particular way of staging politics, of being political, as precisely this, as a question, rather than as an ontological truth or political yearning, because it might make us more attentive to the new politics of distribution and claims making that is underway in much of the world in the context of inclusive growth. Thank you.